I gave my son a country house. When I got there, he was sitting on the porch looking exhausted. His wife's family had just moved in. They were treating him like a servant and running up huge bills. 5 minutes later, they were all on the driveway, and I said just 3 words to her before closing the gate. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. There's a language in the bones of a well-built house. It speaks of integrity, of strength, of a foundation laid not just with concrete, but with intention. I've spent my life learning that language. First as a young woman with a hammer in her hand, and later as the head of Washington Homes, an empire I built from the red Georgia clay with my own 2 hands. Every house bearing my name tells a story, but the country house, the one nestled in 200 acres of rolling hills north of the city, that one was a poem. I didn't just build it for my son, Andre. I built it with him in my mind. I knew where the morning sun would hit the breakfast nook because I knew he loved to sketch in the early light. I specified reinforced beams in the old barn out back, envisioning the architectural studio he'd always dreamed of. The wide, welcoming porch was made for him, a gentle soul who found peace in the quiet hum of the cicadas at dusk. It was more than a gift of property, it was a testament to my love for him, a solid, tangible foundation for the life I knew he deserved. The first few months after he and his wife Simone moved in were a portrait of the very dream I'd held. When I'd visit, I'd find them on the porch swing, his arm around her, their laughter echoing in the evening air. The house was filled with the scent of Simone's baking and the sight of Andre's blueprints spread across the massive oak dining table. He was happy, truly happy in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. The exhaustion that had clung to him from his years at a cutthroat city firm had vanished, replaced by a quiet, contented energy. "It's perfect, Mom," he'd told me one Sunday, his eyes sweeping across the fields that rolled away from the house. "It's more than a house. It's a place to breathe." Simone, too, seemed to blossom there. She had a genuine talent for making a house a home, filling the rooms with warmth and life. She planted a sprawling vegetable garden, her hands covered in rich soil, her face glowing with a satisfaction I knew she'd never found in her high-stress marketing job. She loved my son, and in that shared love the house became a true sanctuary. I saw it as the start of their legacy. Andre, the brilliant, gentle-natured creator, and Simone, the warm, nurturing heart of the home. Together, in the fortress of security and peace I had provided, they would build a beautiful life. I had laid the foundation, the rest was up to them. I had given them the world. I never imagined that Simone would, in turn, give it all away. The first sign of trouble arrived not with a bang, but with a whimper. A carefully orchestrated, manipulative whimper delivered through a phone line. I was visiting Andre and Simone for the weekend, enjoying the rare pleasure of simply being a mother instead of a CEO. We were sitting on the porch sipping iced tea when Simone's phone rang. I saw the name Mama flash on the screen, and Simone's serene expression immediately tightened. She walked to the far end of the porch for privacy, but in the still country air I could hear the one-sided conversation, a slow, sad descent into a trap I could see as clearly as if it were a faulty blueprint. Simone's voice was a soft murmur of concern, punctuated by long listening silences. "Oh, Mama, no. Are you sure? But what did the landlord say?" "No, of course. It's not your fault." I watched my son. Andre's face was a study in weary resignation. He had heard this tone before. He knew what was coming. He set down his glass, the gentle clink on the wooden table a small sad sound of defeat. Simone's voice grew more earnest, more pleading. "Don't cry, Mama. Please? We'll figure something out. Of course you can. Just for a little while, until you're back on your feet." She ended the call and stood for a long moment, her back to us, her shoulders slumped. When she turned around, her eyes were filled with tears but also with a kind of defensive resolve. She had already made a decision and she was preparing to defend it. "That was my mother," she announced, unnecessarily. "Her landlord is raising the rent again. She can't afford it. She's just so stressed." Andre said nothing. He just looked at his wife, his expression patient, waiting. "I told her she and Darnell could come stay with us," Simone finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Just for a couple of weeks, a month, at most, just until they can find a new place and get back on their feet." The air on the porch grew heavy. A couple of weeks. I had run enough construction projects to know that a temporary solution, when poorly planned, has a way of becoming a permanent problem. Patsy Powell and her layabout son Darnell were not a temporary problem. They were a foundational rot, and my daughter-in-law was about to willingly invite them into the heart of her beautiful new home. I watched my son. I saw the conflict in his eyes. He was a creator, a builder, not a fighter. His instinct was always to smooth things over, to keep the peace. He loved his wife, and he knew how deeply her sense of guilt and misplaced loyalty to her family ran. He knew that to say no would be to start a war. He didn't have the energy to fight. He looked at Simone's pleading, tear-streaked face, and he did what he always did. He capitulated. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet. "A couple of weeks. But Simone, we have to have clear boundaries." Simone's face flooded with relief. She rushed over and kissed him, a gesture of gratitude for his surrender. "Thank you, baby," she whispered. "You won't even know they're here, I promise." It was a promise she was in no position to keep. I sat in my chair, the iced tea in my glass now warm and bitter. I said nothing. It was not my place. This was their home, their marriage, their decision, but I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. The foundation was solid, the house was strong, but I knew with the certainty a structural engineer looking at a hairline crack, that the first tremor had just hit, and the storm was coming. They did not arrive like guests. They arrived like a conquering army. Their beat-up sedan groaning up the long gravel driveway, a plume of exhaust smoke trailing behind it like a victory flag. Patsy Powell, my daughter-in-law's mother, emerged from the passenger side, her arms wide, her face arranged in an expression of theatrical tearful gratitude. Her son Darnell, a man in his late 20s with the lazy entitled posture a teenager, slouched out of the driver's seat, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. The invasion began immediately. "Oh, my baby girl!" Patsy wailed, enveloping Simone in a suffocating hug. "You have saved our lives. This place, it's a palace. I knew you'd land on your feet." Her eyes swept over the grand facade of the house, not with awe but with a kind of smug, proprietary satisfaction. This was not a temporary refuge. This was her new standard of living. Darnell, meanwhile, flicked his cigarette butt onto the pristine lawn, a small act of casual desecration. He looked at Andre, who was standing awkwardly on the porch, and gave him a lazy familiar nod. "Sup, man," he said, as if Andre were a valet. "Where do you want this stuff?" He gestured to the trunk of the car, which was packed to the bursting point. For people who were only staying for a couple of weeks, they had brought an astonishing amount of luggage. The next few hours were a blur of disruption. The quiet sanctuary Andre and Simone had built was shattered by the loud, grating frequency of the Powell clan. Patsy immediately began a running commentary on the house, her compliments laced with subtle backhanded criticisms. "Oh, this kitchen is just beautiful, Simone. So much space. Of course, the backsplash is a little dated, but we can fix that. And these curtains, honey. No, we'll go shopping tomorrow and find something with a little more life." She was not a guest offering suggestions. She was a new homeowner making a punch list. Darnell, for his part, made a beeline for the most comfortable sofa in the living room, flopped down with his feet on the coffee table, and immediately began surfing through the television channels with a loud, impatient clicking. He found a sports game, turned the volume up to a deafening level, and announced to the room at large, "Yo, what's the Wi-Fi password? The signal in here is weak." The promise of a couple of weeks began to feel like a sick joke before the first day was even over. That evening, as Simone was giving her family the grand tour, Darnell made his official declaration of independence from the working world. "Yeah, I told my boss at the warehouse to stick it," he bragged, leaning against the doorframe of the master bedroom, a room he seemed to find perfectly acceptable to enter without an invitation. "I told him, I'm done with this dead-end gig. It's time for me to find my passion. This place," he said, gesturing vaguely at the beautiful home around him, "is the perfect spot to get my head right. No stress." Andre, who was standing beside me, flinched as if he'd been struck. The message was clear. Darnell was not here to get back on his feet. He was here to put his feet up, permanently on my son's coffee table. Later that night, long after the Powells had retired to the 2 guest bedrooms they had claimed as their own, I found Andre in the kitchen, staring out the window into the darkness. "Are you all right?" I asked softly. He shook his head, a slow, tired movement. "They're not guests, Mom," he whispered, his voice filled with a dawning horror. "They're squatters." He was right. The Powell clan had not come for a visit. They had come to occupy. The invasion was complete. The siege had just begun. The couple of weeks bled into a month, and the country house, once a sanctuary of peace and creativity, was transformed into a full-service, all-inclusive resort with a staff of one. My son, Andre, a man who had designed award-winning buildings, a man with a mind for the elegant complexities of form and function, was reduced to the role of an unpaid concierge, butler, and chauffeur in his own home. The days took on a grim, predictable rhythm. Andre's mornings, once reserved for sketching and quiet contemplation, were now shattered by the demands of his new housemates. He would come downstairs to find Patsy sitting at the kitchen island, a queen holding court, waiting to be served. "Andre, honey," she'd call out, her voice a syrupy, manipulative coo, "be a dear and make your mother-in-law a cup of that fancy coffee you like. The pods are just too confusing for me." Darnell, who rarely surfaced before noon, would then require transportation. He never asked, he informed. "Yo Dre, I need the keys to the SUV," he'd say, tossing a dirty shirt onto a chair. "Gotta run into town." He never specified why he was going or when he would be back. Andre's car, the one he had saved for years to buy, became Darnell's personal Uber, returning hours later with the gas tank on empty and a new collection of fast food wrappers littering the passenger seat. The house itself became a testament to their sloth. Darnell would spend his afternoons lounging by the pool, Andre so meticulously maintained, leaving a trail of wet towels, empty beer bottles, and sticky popsicle wrappers in his wake. Patsy, in her quest to liven the place up, would rearrange furniture, leaving scratches on the hardwood floors, and then complain that the house was too difficult to keep clean. Andre became a ghost in his own home, a silent, weary servant trailing in their destructive wake. He'd clean the pool, he'd wash the dishes they left piled in the sink. He'd pick up the clothes they shed like a second skin. He did it all with a quiet, stoic resignation, his shoulders slumping a little lower with each passing day. He was trying to keep the peace, to avoid the confrontation he knew would shatter his wife. But the peace was a fiction, and he was the only one paying the price for it. The ultimate indignity, the moment that I knew would become a permanent scar tissue memory for him, came on a Friday afternoon. Patsy, who had decided to host a small dinner party for some of her own friends the following evening, approached Andre in his studio. He was at his drafting table for the first time in weeks, trying to reclaim a small piece of his own life, his own passion. She did not knock. She simply walked in, a long, handwritten list in her hand. "Andre," she announced, her tone that of a busy executive delegating to an assistant, "I need you to run to the store for me. I'm making my famous gumbo tomorrow, and I need a few things." She handed him the list. It was not a list of a few things. It was a 3-page single-spaced document detailing a complex and expensive array of ingredients. Fresh Gulf shrimp, andouille sausage from a specific high-end deli. Premium file powder, a particular brand of imported French bread. At the bottom she had written in large underlined letters, "Get the good stuff, not that cheap Kroger brand." Andre stared at the list, his face a pale blank mask of disbelief. She was not just asking him to run an errand, she was ordering him to provision a party for her friends, in his house with his money, and she was dictating the quality of the ingredients as if he were a catering manager who might try to cut corners. He looked up from the list, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. But Patsy was already walking away, her mind on to the next task she could assign her new, unpaid servant. "And don't forget the wine," she called over her shoulder. "Something nice. A French Bordeaux, maybe." He stood there for a long time, the list clutched in his hand. The architect, the master of his own beautiful home, had just been handed his official job description. He was the help. The physical and emotional toll of the occupation was evident on my son's face every time I spoke to him. But the full quantifiable cost of the Powell clan's parasitic invasion arrived, as it so often does, in a series of thin, innocuous-looking envelopes delivered by the U.S. Postal Service. Andre had always been meticulous about his finances. It was a trait he'd inherited from me, a belief that a well-managed budget was the foundation of a well-managed life. He and Simone had a system, a joint account for household expenses, a clear budget for utilities, groceries, and entertainment. It was a system that, in the space of 1 month, had been utterly and completely broken. He called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice a dead, lifeless monotone that scared me more than any shout would have. "Mom," he said, "I think you need to see this." I drove out the next morning. I found him not in his studio, not on his porch, but at the oak dining table, the same table where he and Simone had once laughed and planned their future. It was now covered in a sea of white paper. Bills. Dozens of them. He looked up as I entered, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. "Look," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He pushed a piece of paper across the table towards me. It was the electricity bill. I remembered the bills from when they had first moved in. A predictable, manageable sum. This one was nearly 3 times that amount. "Darnell?" Andre explained, his voice devoid of emotion. He moved the big screen TV into his bedroom, leaves it on all night, says he can't sleep without the noise. And Patsy, she runs the dishwasher 3 times a day for a single plate and a coffee cup. He pushed another bill towards me. The water bill, it too had tripled. "Patsy takes 3, maybe 4 baths a day," he said. "Says it's for her nerves, and Darnell likes to wash the SUV every morning." My SUV. The most damning evidence, however, was not the utility bills. It was the credit card statement. It was a joint card Simone had, one she had given her mother access to, with a small limit for emergencies only. The statement was 8 pages long. I picked it up, my hands suddenly feeling cold. The charges were a litany of shameless, unrestrained consumerism: Amazon, Best Buy, Zappos, Nordstrom. There were charges for a new top-of-the-line gaming console, a 70-inch television, presumably the one now in Darnell's room, multiple pairs of expensive sneakers, designer handbags, a new wardrobe of clothes for Patsy. All of it, of course, had been shipped directly to the country house. The total was staggering. They had not just exceeded the small limit, they had maxed out the card and incurred a series of over-limit fees. The balance was well into the 5-figure range. This was not a family in need, taking advantage of a temporary situation. This was a calculated, systematic looting. They were treating my son's home and his finances as an open vault, a limitless resource to be plundered for their own selfish, materialistic desires.
I don't understand,"
Andre whispered, shaking his head in a kind of dazed disbelief. "How could they do this? How could she let them do this?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain that was deeper than any financial loss. It was the pain of a profound, intimate betrayal. He had opened his home, his heart, his life to his wife's family, and they, in return, had treated him not as a son, but as a mark. They were not just running up bills, they were bankrupting his trust, his spirit, and the very foundation of his marriage. The discovery of the bills was the breaking point. The quiet, non-confrontational man I had raised was finally pushed past the edge of his own gentle nature. That evening, after the pals had retired to their respective rooms to enjoy their newly acquired electronics, Andre decided he had to speak to his wife. He had to try to make her see. He waited for Simone in their bedroom, the credit card statement clutched in his hand like a piece of damning evidence in a trial. He told me about the conversation later, his voice heavy with the memory of its failure. He had tried to be calm, he had tried to be rational. He laid the bills out on the bed, not as an accusation but as a problem they needed to solve together. "Simone," he began, his voice quiet, "we need to talk about this. The spending it's out of control. We can't sustain this." Simone looked at the bills and her immediate reaction was not concern but a flash of defensive anger. "They're my family, Andre," she said, her voice sharp. "They're just getting settled. They need things. They need a 70-inch television and $400 sneakers?" Andre asked, his own voice beginning to rise despite his best efforts. "Simone, this is thousands of dollars. We have a budget, we have plans, we were saving for the studio. And we'll still build the studio," she insisted, her voice taking on a high, wounded tone. It's going to take a little longer, that's all. You have to understand, Andre. My mother, my brother, they've never had anything nice in their entire lives. They see what we have, this beautiful house, all this stuff. Can you blame them for wanting a little piece of it? For wanting to feel comfortable?" Her words were a masterclass in deflection, a series of emotional smoke bombs designed to obscure the core issue. She was reframing their shameless greed as a kind of pitiable, understandable desire. She was painting them as victims of circumstance, and him by extension as the ungenerous, stingy villain who was denying them their small taste of happiness. "Comfortable?" Andre's voice finally broke, the frustration and exhaustion of the past month pouring out of him. "Simone, I'm not comfortable. I'm not comfortable being treated like a servant in my own home. I'm not comfortable having my car used as a free taxi service. I'm not comfortable having your brother, a grown man, sit on my couch all day while I clean up his messes. This isn't about generosity, This is about respect. And they have shown me none. They have shown us none. He was pleading with her, begging her to see the situation from his perspective. To stand with him, her husband, against the invasion. But Simone's loyalty was a tangled, complicated thing. It was bound up in a lifetime of guilt. A feeling that she had escaped a life of struggle that her family was still trapped in. She saw their behavior not as an act of disrespect towards her husband, but as a validation of her own success. Her family was finally benefiting from the life she had built. To criticize them was to criticize her own choices. "You're exaggerating," she said, her voice cold. "Their family is messy. You need to be a little more patient. A little more understanding. They'll get on their feet. This isn't permanent." But it was. The conversation, the one that was supposed to be a turning point, was a dead end. Simone had made her choice. She had chosen her parasitic, manipulative family over the well-being of her own husband. The stalemate was absolute. Andre told me he had slept in the guest room that night. The one room the Powells hadn't claimed. He lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house a mockery of the peace he had once found there. He felt utterly, completely alone. He was a man trapped in his own home, in his own marriage, with no allies and no way out. The foundation of his life, which had seemed so solid just a few short months ago, was cracking beneath his feet. And he was beginning to understand that it was not a problem he could fix on his own. I gave him a day. I waited for him to call me back to tell me that he and Simone had talked it through, that they had found a solution. The call never came. The silence from the country house was a heavy, ominous thing. I knew, with a mother's intuition that is more certain than any scientific fact, that my son was at his breaking point. I decided to pay a surprise visit. I didn't go empty-handed. I stopped at a specialty nursery on the way, and purchased a magnificent Japanese maple tree. It was a rare, lace-leaf variety. Its delicate crimson leaves, a perfect fiery red. It was a symbol of strength, of beauty, of putting down roots. It was a housewarming gift, a month late, but a message of hope, a reminder of the beautiful permanent life I wanted him to build. As I turned my truck into the long gravel driveway, my heart ached at the sheer beauty of the place. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the house, the white columns of the porch gleaming, the fields rolling away into the hazy blue of the hills. It was a picture of peace, a portrait of a perfect life. But as I got closer, I saw a single discordant note in the symphony. My son? He was sitting alone on the grand porch steps, the same steps where he and Simone had once sat and laughed. He was not looking at the view. He was staring at the ground between his feet, his shoulders slumped in a posture of such profound soul-deep exhaustion that it stole the breath from my lungs. He was wearing the clothes he'd had on the day before, now rumpled and stained. He looked like a refugee, a displaced person in his own land. He looked like a man who was being crushed, slowly and systematically, by the weight of his own beautiful home. My blood, which had been simmering at a low boil for weeks, flashed into a hot rage. It was the primal protective fury of a mother seeing her child in pain, the careful professional detachment I had maintained, the belief that I should let them handle their own problems. It all evaporated in that instant. This was no longer a marital dispute. This was an assault, and you do not under any circumstances assault my son. I pulled the truck to a halt, the tires crunching on the gravel. I got out, leaving the beautiful, hopeful tree in the back. This was no longer a day for planting trees. This was a day for pulling weeds. Andre looked up as I approached, his face a hollow mask. He tried to smile, but it was a pathetic, broken thing. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see my son," I said, my own voice low and dangerously calm. I sat down on the step beside him, and for a long moment we just sat in silence. Finally he spoke. The words a quiet, broken torrent of his misery. He told me about the failed confrontation with Simone. He told me about sleeping in the guest room. He told me about the utter suffocating loneliness of his own life. "I don't know what to do," he finished, his voice raw with despair. "I feel like a stranger here, like a servant, and she doesn't see it, or she won't see it. I'm losing my home, Mom. I think I'm losing my wife." I put my arm around his slumped shoulders. I felt the tremor of his silent sobs. I looked at the magnificent house I had built for him, this palace that had become his prison. The rage in my chest cooled, hardening into a single diamond-hard point of resolve. I had built this house. I had laid its foundation. And I would be damned if I was going to stand by and watch a pair of lazy entitled grifters tear it down. And take my son with it. I stood up. Where are they? I asked, my voice devoid of all emotion. Darnell's in the living room watching TV, he said, his voice muffled. Patsy's in the kitchen, I think. She wanted me to make her a smoothie. I looked down at my son, at his broken, defeated form. You stay here, I said, my voice as calm and as final as a judge's gavel. I'll handle this. I walked up the porch steps and through the front door of the house I had built. The change was immediate and visceral. The air, which had once been filled with a sense of peace and creative energy, was now thick and stagnant with the cloying atmosphere of sloth and entitlement. The house didn't feel like Andre's home anymore. It felt like a low-budget, all-inclusive resort on the last day of a very long, very cheap holiday. My assessment began the moment I stepped inside. My mind, honed by decades of running construction sites where a single misplaced measurement could cost millions, took in the data with a cold, rapid efficiency. Observation 1. The living room. The once pristine space was a disaster zone. A half-dozen empty glasses, some containing the curdled remnants of milk, were scattered across the coffee table. A greasy pizza box sat open on the floor, and sprawled across the custom-made sofa, his bare feet propped up on a silk cushion Simone had treasured, was Darnell Powell. He was staring, slack-jawed, at the 70-inch television that was blasting a reality show at a volume that made the windows vibrate. He was wearing a pair of boxer shorts and a stained t-shirt. He saw me enter, registered my presence with a flicker of his dull eyes, and then turned his attention back to the screen without a word. He did not greet me. He did not acknowledge me. I was simply a new, uninteresting object that had appeared in his field of vision. Observation 2. The kitchen. I proceeded to the kitchen, the heart of the home which was now a landscape of neglect. The sink was piled high with dirty dishes. A sticky brown ring of dried coffee stained the white marble countertop, and the floor was littered with crumbs. Patsy Powell was standing by the state-of-the-art blender I had bought for them as a wedding gift, a look of profound theatrical irritation on her face. She was holding her phone to her ear, her voice a loud whining complaint. I know, girl, she was saying, I just can't find a thing in this kitchen, and Andre is nowhere to be found. I've been waiting for my kale and mango smoothie for 20 minutes. The service around here has really gone downhill. She saw me and her expression shifted instantly to one of syrupy false delight. Lorraine, she exclaimed, as if my arrival were a wonderful surprise. What a treat! You're just in time to see if you can figure out this complicated new blender for me. My poor nerves are just shot today. She did not ask how I was. She did not offer me a glass of water. She immediately tried to press me into the same role of service she had assigned my son. The entire assessment from the moment I walked through the door to the moment Patsy tried to make me her smoothie technician took less than 2 minutes. The data was collected. The evidence was irrefutable. The defendants were guilty. Guilty of a hostile takeover of my son's home. Guilty of a campaign of systematic disrespect. Guilty of a level of sloth and entitlement, so profound it was almost a form of art. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in argument. A lifetime of running rough-and-tumble construction crews had taught me that the most effective form of authority is a quiet, unshakable, and absolutely final command. The verdict was in. The sentencing was about to begin. I walked from the kitchen back into the living room, my movements calm and deliberate. I stood directly between Darnell and the television, blocking his view. His head lolled to the side, a look of lazy irritation on his face. Yo, you're in the way, he mumbled, his eyes still trying to find the screen around me. I picked up the remote control from the coffee table and pressed the power button. The television screen went black, plunging the room into an abrupt, shocking silence. Darnell finally sat up, a flicker of genuine anger in his dull eyes. Hey, what's the big idea? I was watching that. I looked down at him, my face a blank, unreadable mask. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the room like a diamond blade. Darnell? I said. Get your things, you're leaving. The command was so simple, so direct, so utterly devoid of any room for negotiation, that it seemed to stun him into a momentary paralysis. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the words not quite computing in his slow-moving brain. I did not wait for his response. I turned and walked back towards the kitchen, where Patsy was still standing by the blender, a look of confused indignation on her face at having been abandoned mid-complaint. Did you hear what just happened? She began, her voice a rising whine. The TV just... I cut her off. I did not raise my voice. I did not change my tone. I simply delivered the second sentence with the same final surgical precision as the first. Patsy, I said, meeting her gaze. Pack your bags. You have 2 minutes. The authority in my voice was not the manufactured theatrical authority of a woman like Patsy, who used volume and complaint as her primary weapons. It was the deep foundational authority of a woman who has signed payroll checks for hundreds of men. A woman who has stared down union bosses and building inspectors. A woman who has built an empire from nothing. It was the authority of a creator in her own creation, and it was absolute. Patsy's jaw dropped. The mask of syrupy sweetness fell away, revealing the raw, ugly face of her entitlement. "Excuse me," she sputtered, her voice rising to a screech. "Who do you think you are talking to me like that in my daughter's home?" "That is where you are mistaken," I replied, my voice still dangerously calm. "This is not your daughter's home, and you are no longer a guest here." I turned my back on her and walked to the foot of the grand staircase. The chaos had begun. I could hear Darnell finally scrambling off the sofa, his voice a confused, angry shout. I could hear Patsy shrieking my name, demanding that Simone come and deal with her crazy mother-in-law. I looked at my watch. The 2-minute clock had started. The eviction was underway. The system was being flushed. The house, which had been stagnant with sloth for a month, exploded into a frenzy of panicked, furious activity. It was the chaos of a kicked-over anthill. Darnell came storming out of the living room, his face red with a combination of confusion and impotent rage. "You can't just kick me out," he shouted, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of masculinity. "I'm a guest here. Your status has been revoked," I said, my voice flat, my eyes on my watch. "You have 90 seconds. Patsy came rushing from the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. "Simone, you get over here right now," she shrieked into the phone. "Your mother-in-law has lost her mind. She's throwing us out. Your own family." Simone, who had clearly been hiding in her bedroom to avoid the brewing storm, came flying down the stairs, her face a mask of frantic desperation. She ran to me, her hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "Lorraine, please," she begged, her voice a high, panicked whine. "What are you doing? You can't do this. They're my family." This was the critical moment, the test of her allegiance. I looked at her, at the daughter-in-law I had once cherished, and I felt nothing but a cold, profound disappointment. Even now, after everything, her first instinct was to protect the parasites, not the host. I did not engage with her pleas. I simply stepped aside, revealing my son Andre, who had come in from the porch and was now standing silently, powerfully at my back. He did not speak. He just stood there, his arms crossed, his face a hard, unyielding mask. He had made his choice. He was standing with me. The sight of her husband, no longer a defeated passive servant, but a silent, solid wall of opposition, seemed to stun Simone into silence. She looked from his face to mine, and in that moment, she must have understood that the rules of the house had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The era of her family's uncontested rule was over. That realization was all it took. The fight went out of the Powell clan. Their blustering and shrieking was predicated on the belief that Andre would never stand up to them, and that Simone would always take their side. Faced with this new, united front, their power evaporated. They were exposed for what they were, a pair of bullies who had just had their bluff called. The anger and indignation were replaced by a frantic, undignified scramble. They ran to their respective rooms, the sound of drawers being thrown open and closets being ransacked, echoing through the house. They were no longer concerned with their rights as guests. They were concerned with grabbing the trove of electronics and designer clothes they had acquired during their month-long looting spree. I stood at the foot of the stairs, my eyes on my watch. 1 minute, I called out, my voice calm and clear. The sounds of their frantic packing intensified. A moment later they came stumbling down the stairs, their arms laden with bags, their faces a mixture of fury and humiliation. They did not look at me. They did not look at Andre. They scurried past us, like rats fleeing a flooding ship, and burst out the front door. I followed them, my son and daughter-in-law trailing silently behind me. The 5-minute eviction was complete. The house was for the first time in a month quiet, but the final act was yet to play out. The scene on the driveway was a tableau of defeated entitlement. Patsy and Darnell stood amidst a chaotic pile of their hastily packed luggage, and the mountain of shopping bags that represented their month-long spree. The late afternoon sun seemed to mock them, casting long pathetic shadows behind their furious, slumped forms. Their luxury resort vacation had come to an abrupt, undignified end. Darnell, ever the picture of impotent rage, kicked one of his own suitcases. "This is crazy," he yelled, though it was unclear to whom he was speaking. "I'm gonna sue. This is like illegal eviction or something." Patsy, for her part, had switched her tactics from shrieking to a kind of low, venomous muttering. "After everything we've done for her," she hissed, glaring at the house. "Ungrateful, the both of them. Wait till her friends hear about this." They were like deposed monarchs, standing on the shores of their lost kingdom, unable to comprehend how their absolute power had been so swiftly and completely dismantled. They had mistaken generosity for weakness for so long that they could not process the sudden, brutal appearance of strength. I stood on the porch, my arms crossed, a silent, immovable sentinel. Andre stood beside me, his presence a quiet, solid affirmation of my actions. The war was over. The occupiers had been repelled. But there was one final casualty to be dealt with: Simone. She stood in the open doorway, her body literally caught between two worlds. On the porch was her husband, her home, the life of peace and security she had chosen. On the driveway was her family, her past, the chaotic, parasitic loyalty she could not seem to escape. She was a woman being torn in two by her own weakness. "You can't just leave them there," she cried, her voice cracking with a mixture of anger and despair. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Where are they supposed to go?" "That is no longer your husband's problem to solve," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Nor is it mine. But they're my family," she wailed, the words a familiar tired refrain. "Yes," I said, "they are, and you have a choice to make." The full, terrible weight of that choice finally seemed to dawn on her. She looked from my face to Andre's, and then back to the two pathetic figures on the driveway. The easy, comfortable life she had taken for granted was suddenly terrifyingly conditional. The foundation of her world was cracking, and she was being forced to decide which side of the fault line she would stand on. The 5-minute eviction was over. The lifelong sentence was about to be handed down. Simone stood in the doorway, paralyzed by her own internal conflict. The easy tears of manipulation she might have once used were gone, replaced by the hard, terrified tears of a woman facing a genuine, life-altering choice. "You're being cruel, Lorraine," she finally whispered, her voice a ragged, desperate plea. "This is my home too. You can't make me choose between my husband and my mother." "I'm not making you choose," I replied, my voice as calm and as cold as the coming evening air. "You made your choice a month ago. You chose to allow your family to disrespect your husband. You chose to allow them to turn his sanctuary into their personal flophouse. You chose to defend their greed over his peace of mind. Every day for the past month you have made this choice. This is not a choice. This is a consequence." From my pocket I took out a small black remote. I had installed the automatic gate at the end of the long driveway myself. A final touch to ensure the privacy and security of the estate. I pressed the button. Far down the driveway, the two halves of the heavy wrought iron gate began to swing shut with a quiet, inexorable hum. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a final physical severing. Patsy and Darnell saw it. A new wave of panic washed over their faces. They were not just being asked to leave, they were being locked out. Permanently. Simone saw it too. The closing gate was a finish line she was on the wrong side of. "No," she gasped, taking a step forward as if she could somehow, through sheer force of will, stop it. "Lorraine, don't." The gate continued its slow, steady journey. It was a visual metaphor for the patience that had finally completely run out. She turned to me, her face a mess of tears and disbelief. "This is my home too," she cried again, the words a desperate last-ditch assertion of a right she had long since forfeited through her actions. "You can't lock me out of my own life." I looked her dead in the eye. The gate was almost closed now, the space between the two halves just a sliver. I waited for the final soft clang as the magnetic lock engaged, a sound of absolute finality that echoed up the driveway. The Powells were gone. The perimeter was secure. I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman who had so catastrophically failed to understand the nature of the gift she had been given, and I delivered the final devastating verdict. The summation of the entire sorry affair. The truth boiled down to its three most brutal, most undeniable words. "This isn't yours." The words landed not with a shout, but with the quiet, devastating force of a wrecking ball. They were a statement of fact, a clarification of title, a final unappealable judgment on her behavior. The house wasn't hers. It was a gift to my son. The security wasn't hers. It was a product of a lifetime of my hard work. The legacy wasn't hers. It was something she had been invited to share, not to desecrate. The fight, the defiance, the last vestiges of her misplaced loyalty, all of it crumbled under the weight of those 3 words. She let out a small, wounded sound like a deflating balloon and sank to her knees in the doorway, her face in her hands, her body racked with the sobs of a woman who had just lost everything, and finally, understood why. The closing of the gate was a sound of profound finality. It left an echoing silence on the porch, broken only by Simone's heartbroken, wrenching sobs. She was a heap of misery in the doorway, a woman who had just watched her entire support system, the one she had sacrificed her marriage for, be literally and figuratively shut out of her life. I did not go to her. I did not offer a word of comfort. My part in this was done. I was the judge who had delivered the sentence. The reconciliation, if there was to be any, was a matter for the 2 people whose marriage was now in ruins. I turned to my son. Andre's face was a mixture of relief, sorrow and a newfound hard-won strength. The weary, defeated man I had found on these steps just an hour ago was gone. In his place was a man who had been reminded of his own worth, of his own power. "I'm going to go pack a bag, Mom," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I need some space. I'll stay with you for a few days." "No," I said, putting a hand on his arm. "You're not. This is your house. You're not going to be driven out of it again." I looked pointedly at the sobbing figure of his wife. "This is your house," I repeated to him, my voice low and clear. "This is your marriage. She is your wife. You need to tell her how you feel. She needs to hear it from you." I had cleared the battlefield for him. It was now up to him to fight for his own peace. I watched as a new resolve hardened in his eyes. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He understood. He walked over to Simone and knelt beside her. He did not touch her, he simply waited for her sobs to subside into ragged, hitched breaths. "Simone," he began, and his voice was not the quiet, gentle murmur she was used to. It was the voice of a man who had finally found his edge. It was clear, it was strong, and it was filled with the pain she had ignored for a month. "Look at me." Slowly she raised her head, her face a mess of tears and shame. "For a month," he said, his voice unwavering, "I have felt like a ghost in my own home. I have been disrespected, I have been used, and I have been ignored. I have cleaned up messes that weren't mine. I have paid for things I didn't want, and I have been treated like an employee by your family. And when I came to you, when I begged you to see what was happening, you chose them. You chose their comfort over my peace. You chose their greed over our future." Every word was a clean, surgical cut, laying bare the truth of her betrayal. "I love you, Simone," he continued, his voice cracking with emotion for the first time. "But I cannot live like this. I will not live like this. My mother is right. She gave me this house as a foundation, and we either build our life on it, together, you and me, or we don't. But there is no room in this marriage for them. Not anymore, not ever again." He laid out his terms, his non-negotiable conditions for their future. "So you have a choice. It's me, and it's us, and it's this life we were supposed to build together, or it's them. But if you choose them, you will have to choose them without me, and without any of this." He stood up, leaving the choice, the final absolute choice, in her hands. He had found his voice. He had reclaimed his power. He had finally become the king of his own castle. Simone looked at her husband, truly seeing him for the first time in weeks. She saw the pain in his eyes, the strength in his posture, the absolute finality in his words, and in that moment she finally understood the catastrophic damage her weakness had caused. "You," she whispered, her voice a broken, pleading sound. "I choose you, Andre. I'm so sorry. I choose you." The reckoning was complete. The long, painful process of rebuilding could now begin. A month later, I drove out to the country house again. This time, I was not on a rescue mission. I was an invited guest for Sunday dinner. The Japanese maple tree I had brought on that terrible day was now planted in the front yard, its fiery red leaves a vibrant, beautiful scar, a reminder of the battle that had been fought and won. The house, when I walked in, was filled with a familiar welcome silence. It was the peaceful, productive silence I remembered from the beginning. The scent of roasting chicken filled the air. There were no televisions blaring, no messes on the floor, No lingering sense of tension. It was a sanctuary once more. I found Andre in the barn. His new studio. The space was transformed. His drafting table was set up in the center, bathed in the light from the large barn doors he had thrown open to the autumn afternoon. He was bent over a set of blueprints, a pencil behind his ear, a look of serene, focused concentration on his face. He was home. "Mom?" he said, looking up with a genuine relaxed smile that reached his eyes. "You're here." We talked as he showed me his new designs. He told me that he and Simone were in counseling. It was hard, he said. There was a lot of trust to rebuild, but for the first time she was really listening. She was facing the hard truths about her family and her own enabling behavior. She had cut off all contact with her mother and brother. A painful but necessary amputation. They were, he said, for the first time a real team. Simone, when she came out to call us in for dinner, was different too. The defensive, brittle energy was gone. She was quieter, more thoughtful. She looked me in the eye, her gaze filled with a humility I had never seen in her before. "Lorraine," she said, her voice soft, "thank you for coming, it means a lot to us." The gratitude was real. The respect was earned. Dinner was a quiet, pleasant affair. We talked about Andre's work, about the new life they were slowly, deliberately building together. The ghosts of the Powell clan were gone. Before I left, as the evening sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, I handed Andre a thick manila envelope. He opened it. Inside were all the bills from the month of the invasion, the tripled utility statements, the 8-page credit card bill. Each one was stamped in bold red ink with 2 words, "Paid in full." Andre looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. "Mom, you didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," I said, putting a hand on his arm. I looked from him, to the house, to the new tree putting down its roots in the rich soil. Every house I build, every project worth a damn has to start with a clean foundation. No outstanding debts, no lingering obligations. He looked at the paid bills and I knew he understood my meaning. The words were not just about money, they were about the future. Their future. The slate had been wiped clean. The financial cost of Simone's mistake had been paid. The emotional cost was something they would have to continue to work on, but now, they could do it without the weight of the past dragging them down. The house was his, the marriage was his, the future was theirs to build, and this time, I knew with a deep and abiding certainty that the foundation was strong enough to last a lifetime.